Welcome to Global Media Network, LLC, Passionate World Talk Radio Network, a wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto, educate, enlighten, entertain. This is the first episode of the topic, Lest We Forget, the USA and the Jews. Each month, we do a different type of horrific historical topic that needs to be discussed and resolved. In our podcast, Lest We Forget, we want to stop history from repeating itself in an endless cycle. I am going to provide you a timeline with the Jews in the United States. Originally, anti-Semitism started a long time ago, before Christ, B.C., they say in Babylonia, Greece, and Rome. So when the people in Europe decided that they wanted religious freedom, they came to the United States. Please keep that in mind. In 1621, the first Jew was Eli Legrand, and he came to Jamestown because Sir Walter Raleigh sent him to the Roanoke colony to look for metals, iron, for example. In 1623, some Jews who had escaped from Eastern Europe and had been living in Recife, Brazil, fled when the Portuguese came back and kicked out the Dutch Indian Trading Company, and they settled into the colony. Unfortunately, the colony they fled to was New Amsterdam, New York, and Peter Stuyvesant, who was in charge of New Amsterdam, believed that Jews were a deceitful race, hateful enemies, and blasphemous of the name of Christ. However, the people who Mr. Stuyvesant worked for, the Dutch East Indian Company, reversed Peter's judgment and granted the Jews the right to settle with the understanding that they took care of their own poor. In other words, the Christians would not take care of them at all. It was a Jewish problem, and the Jewish community had to take care of it. By the late 1600s, Roger Williams was in Rhode Island, and he granted religious tolerance towards the Jews, probably one of the first, because despite what you hear about the Pilgrim Fathers, unless you are a Protestant, there was no such thing as freedom of religion for you. In 1730, the first synagogue was built on Mill Street in New York City, and it was called the Congregation Shereth Israel. In 1740, Parliament, we're still attached to England, passed the Plantation Act, permitting Jews to be naturalized in the colonies. Although, again, each colony could determine whether or not they would allow the Jews to become full colonists with all their rights. In 1765, with the Stamp Act, the Jewish merchant's signature appeared on various non-importation resolutions, again adopted by the individual colonies. By 1776, Thomas Jefferson, one of our forefathers, wrote to the Jewish physician Dr. Jacob de la Motte in Charleston, South Carolina, stating, quote, religious freedom is the basis of American democracy, unquote. Keep that in mind. Also, Jefferson sponsored a bill which the Virginia legislature denied because it gave the Jews naturalization. Thomas Jefferson quoted John Locke, who said, quote, "Neither pagan nor Mohammedan nor Jews ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of religion," which was something was considered before the Constitution and the Declaration were written. In 1787, Jefferson summed up his beliefs about Jews when he was talking to his nephew and said, "Those facts in the Bible are contradictive nature." And his fellow delegate, John Adams, agreed by stating, "In respect to God, the principle of Hebrew is fear." In 1779, the Bill of Establishing Religious Freedom was passed in Virginia. It was adopted in 1785. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, plan, or ministry whatsoever on account of his religious beliefs. In the same year, 1785, Thomas Jefferson wrote a bill of establishing a religious freedom in Virginia, and he said that establishing religious freedom provided civic toleration for American Jews. In 1779, Virginia adopted the bill for established religious freedom and proclaimed, quote, "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs, but that all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise affect their civil capacities." In 1790, George Washington wrote a letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, and proclaimed that liberty is an inherent right, and the U.S. government guarantees that no bigotry, sanction, persecutor, and that America was a place where Jews were welcomed as equals. In 1787 and 1791, two important legislation was passed. In 1787, the Federal Constitution, and in 1791, the Bill of Rights, which outlawed religious tests as qualifications to any office or public stress. In 1800 and 1861, which of course involved the Civil War, 2 million immigrants, including Jews, arrived in America. And the German Jews, who were the most present, were pleased because of the economic and social opportunities that were being provided to them. You're wondering who some of the famous Jewish immigrants were that came to our country? Joseph Salomon, 1837, and everybody knows this guy, Levi Strauss, 1847. In those years between 1800 and 1861, Cincinnati became the seat of America's Reform Judaism. During the Civil War, 1861 to 1805, the immigration of Jews slowed, and this ought to be interesting. The Jews who lived down south supported the Confederacy, and the Jews that lived up north supported the Union. By the 1880s, there were arrival of more German Jews. Most of them came from Eastern Europe. However, there was an increase in anti-Semitism in Europe and Eastern Europe, and because of the war of economic and social promise in America, the Eastern Europe Jews flocked to America and worked hard, basically in the garment and jewelry industry. Because immigrants, mostly Jewish immigrants, worked in harsh conditions with long hours, formerly known as sweatshops, the Jewish trade union emerged in support of the workers, men, women, and children. However, Jews in America separated into three different groups: the Reform, the Conservative, and the Orthodox. And each group offered a different meaning of what being a Jew meant in America. In 1879, the term anti-Semitism originated with German journalist Wilhelm Marm to describe hatred or hostility toward Jews. From 1895 to the 1920s, the Jews formed their own charitable organization, and they became a unifying source in the American Jewish community. By the turn of the early 20th century, 1.7 million more Eastern European Jews immigrated to the United States. The people here who already lived here felt threatened. In response, they formed NATIVIST organizations that fought for federal restrictions on immigration. Does that sound familiar? In 1915, a Jewish businessman, Leo Frank, he was falsely accused. He was in prison for supposedly murdering a 13-year-old Christian girl. He did not, but the mob came in, grabbed him from jail, and lynched him. He was innocent. In 1920, other notable and famous anti-Semitism acts were performed by people who we have set up as American heroes. Henry Ford, he published in a 1920s newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which was an outlet for anti-Semitic opinions and beliefs and propaganda. And in the article, Mr. Ford wrote, and I quote, "There's a Jewish plan to control the world, not by territorial acquisition, not by military aggression, not by government subjugation, but by control of the machinery of commerce and exchange." Another famous anti-Semitic person was the aviator Charles Lindbergh. He became the designated speaker for the American First Community, who opposed the entry of the U.S. into World War II. Another known anti-Semitic during that period was, quote, the radio priest, unquote, Father Charles Coughlin, who warned and threatened about world Jewish domination. During the 20s, 30s, and 40s down south, another infamous group known as the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, targeted the Jewish population along with their witch hunts on the blacks on every class level. The KKK targeted Jews, and they procured their women and girls and sold them to enhance their own monetary interests. In 1940s, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, Irish Catholic gangs roved the streets in, quote, Jew hunts, unquote, that accumulated in physical assaults. During the 30s and 40s, within the entertainment business world, the Jews confronted tight restrictions that kept them out of law firms, medical professions, universities and colleges, fraternities, hotels, country clubs. Signs said, no niggers or Jews allowed. One hotel boasted in an advertisement, no Hebrews or tubercular guests received. Colleges and universities of higher learning like Harvard or Columbia and Princeton imposed strict quotas on how many Jews they would admit. A question on the Sarah Lawrence College application that Jews had to face was, has your daughter been brought up to strict Sunday observance? The Jews were also subjugated to restrictive real estate covenants that prevented them from living in particular neighborhoods. By the 1960s, anti-Semitism gained steam in part because of the Holocaust and because General Eisenhower ordered every soldier to visit the concentration camps for them to see the horrors of people who remained alive and how Hitler used those camps to exterminate an entire culture, society, and religion. From 1946 to 1959, the number of Americans who heard anti-Semitism, according to the historian Lenore Denniston, declined from 64% to 12% by 1959. In the 1960s, Pope Vatican II adopted a version of the, quote, Nostra Aetate, and rescinded the charge that Jews were responsible in killing the Christ. That was nice. By the mid-1960s, there were still problems. The communist movement, dubbed the Cold War, aligned their hatred of religion with the hatred of Jews. Democratic Congressman John E. Rankin of Mississippi proclaimed that the issue of the era was, quote, Yiddish communism versus Christian civilization, unquote. One rabbi, Abraham Herschel, joined Martin Luther King Jr. to march for voting rights in Selma, Alabama. He saw banners that read, Coons, Kikes, and Niggers go home. In 1990, the American First Pundit and future presidential candidate Patrick Buchanan blamed Operation Desert Storm on, quote, the Israelite Defense Ministry and its Amen Corner in the United States. But you also heard it from the left side on politics. The Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, who have made hateful comments about Jews since the early 1980s, warned supporters of, quote, satanic Jews who have infected the whole world with poison and deceit, unquote. Even college campuses criticized Israel and became quite anti-Semitic. Bringing us to the present, the 21st century. In 2013, this is all from The Atlantic, who stated, one, that Donald Trump used coded language, even though his daughter, son-in-law, and his grandchildren are Jewish. Trump wrote an anti-Semitic statement about The Daily Show, which he criticizes by saying, I promise you that I'm much smarter than Jonathan Leibowitz. Oh, I mean Jon Stewart. In 2016, Trump retweeted messages from anti-Semitic supporters and refused to clearly distance himself from the former KKK Grand Wizard, David Duke. He embraced the label of American First, which carries anti-Semitic rhetoric. When he tweeted about Hillary Clinton, he showed a photograph of her, and beside her was the Star of David, and in front of the Clinton and Star of David were piles of money with his text that read, most corrupt candidate ever. Trump also was warned about his anti-Semitic implications, alleging to a global conspiracy, but his campaign ran an ad showing images of three Jews, the billionaire philanthropist George Soros, the then chair of the Federal Reserve Janet Yellen, and Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein. In it, Trump said, quote, the establishment has trillions of dollars at stake in this election, For those who control the levels of power in Washington and for the global special interests, they partner with these people that don't have your good in mind. And of course, the levers of powers was equal to the protocols of the elders of Zion. When he became president, he cooperated with the so-called alternate right, which includes many anti-Semitic groups. The head of their preferred platform, Breitbart News, has a seat in the Oval Office through advisor Steve Bannon, unquote. 2017. The White House's official message on Holocaust Remembrance Day did not mention Jews or anti-Semitism, but Trump refused to acknowledge it, and he said publicly that the Jews will not replace us. Republican Congressman in Illinois, Arthur Jones, once called the Holocaust an, quote, international extortion racket. The National Republican Congressional Committee released an ad in Minnesota that depicts Soros as a puppet master, standing over piles of cash, causing social unrest, and owning Democrat Dan Sheehan. The GOP and Trump had a very hard line about anti-immigration policies, which play into the history of white nationalism. After this, anti-Semitic incidents increased by 57%, according to the Anti-Defamation League. In Pittsburgh, from January to September 2018, 50 anti-Semitic attacks were reported by the Jewish Chronicle. 2 studies, one by the Anti-Defamation League and another by a Columbia University professor, Jonathan Albright, found that the number of anti-Semitic posts have increased on Instagram and Twitter. One frequent target has been the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, which has been lobbying for the admission of refugees. Robert D. Bowers had this to say when he posted online: HIAS likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Through your optics, I'm going in. Many people in the Jewish community have remained silent in the hopes that these are just minor, inconsequential incidents, and they believe that the GOP and Trump are strong advocates for Israel and of Benjamin Netanyahu government. And of course, Trump's response to all of this was, especially to the massacre in Pittsburgh, is that American synagogues hire armed guards with assault weapons. And now on to the second part of the program with Lisa Skinner, who will talk to you about the Jews in Europe, particularly World War II.
On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, ruler of the Nazi regime, took his own life by suicide. On May 9th, 1945, World War II officially came to an end when Germany signed an unconditional surrender. By the end of the war, the Nazi regime and its collaborators had managed to inhumanely murder 6 million people, most of them Jews. How and why could this have happened? What events led up to this historic atrocity? Well, let's take a closer look at how a perfect storm of circumstances led to the horrific genocide of one race of people. Let's begin by first defining what an atrocity is. According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, an atrocity is a shockingly bad or atrocious act, object, or situation. As in badness, it's the state or quality of being utterly evil. As in cruelty, it's the disposition to willfully inflict pain and suffering on others. And this is what happened during World War II under the Nazi regime. According to the research that we've all done, yes, anti-Semitism did play a major role in Adolf Hitler's thinking and in the Nazi ideology. However, as history has revealed, Hitler did not invent the hatred of Jews. Jews in Europe had been victims of discrimination and persecution since the Middle Ages, just as Lillian described, often for religious reasons. Christians saw the Jewish faith as an aberration that had to be extinguished. Jews were sometimes forced to convert, or they were not allowed to practice certain professions. In the 19th century, religion played a less important role. It was replaced by theories about the differences between races and people. For example, the belief that the Jews belonged to a different race of people than the Germans began to catch on. Even Jews who had converted to Christianity were still seen as different because of their bloodline. Anti-Semitism, xenophobia, the Great Depression, and bureaucratic indifference all tempered America's willingness to provide a safe haven for hundreds of thousands of desperate Jews seeking to flee Nazi-controlled areas of Europe. In 1933, before the Nazi reign, there were 9 million Jews living in Europe. By 1945, 2 out of 3 Jews had been slaughtered. When Hitler was appointed chancellor and came into power in 1933, he turned Germany into a dictatorship and began his wrath to put similar ideas into practice. The first thing the Nazi Party did as soon as it came into power was to start the dehumanization campaign of the Jews. The German defeat of World War I was a bitter pill for the Germans to swallow, and for Hitler too. In nationalist and right-wing conservative circles, a "we were stabbed in the back" legend became popular amongst the Germans. They believed that they did not lose World War I on the battlefield, but through the betrayal at home by the Jews, Social Democrats, and the Communists. The prejudice that developed about the role of the Jews in the war were false. As a matter of fact, an investigation carried out by the German government proved that to be true. Over 100,000 German and Austrian Jews had fought for their fatherland. After the First World War, Germany was in chaos. Once the German emperor had gone, rebellions erupted everywhere. Left-wing groups tried to seize power in many places. In Munich, a People's Republic of Bavaria was proclaimed during a brief revolution. It provoked a right-wing reaction, which in turn resulted in bloodshed. Well, Hitler was very impressed by these events. So this was the beginning of Hitler's political career. His anti-Semitism rants were becoming increasingly radical. He argued for an anti-Semitism of the mind, which would ultimately lead to the removal and annihilation of the Jews before they could take over the world, which is what the Germans believed was their ultimate goal. As early as August 1920, Hitler compared the Jews to germs, lice, and parasites, not humans or Germans. He said that they were good, manipulative, and uncivilized, and that money was the god of the Jews who would commit the greatest crimes to earn money and wouldn't rest until they could sit on a great stack of the money. He stated that diseases cannot be controlled unless you destroy their causes, and the influence of the Jews would never disappear without removing its cause, which was the Jew, from our midst. These radical ideas paved the way for mass murder of 6 million people in the 1940s. As it turns out, Hitler blamed the Jews for everything that was wrong with the world. Germany was weak and in decline due to the Jewish influence. According to Hitler, the Jews were after world dominance, and they would not hesitate to use all possible means, including capitalism. Hitler saw the opportunity to take advantage of the existing prejudice that already linked the Jews to monetary power and financial gain. Hitler preached that communism was a Jewish conspiracy and falsely spread that the larger part of the communist leaders were Jewish, which simply was not true. This idea of Jewish communism led to the shocking repercussions that occurred in World War II. Well, another ideology that Hitler sermonized was that people were either a high race or a low race. The Germans belonged to the high race, and of course the Jews to the lower race. Hitler reconciled that the German people could only be a strong race if they were pure, and therefore could not interbreed with anyone who was not part of the Aryan race. People with hereditary disease were considered harmful, and so were people with physical or mental disabilities, as well as alcoholics and those considered to be incorrigible criminals. Once the Nazis came to power, these ideas led to the forced sterilization and killing of human beings. The ideals that Hitler developed in the 1920s remained the same until his death in 1945. What did change, however, is that in 1933 he was handed the power to start realizing them and convincing others that they were true. During the 1930s, he did everything in his power to expel the Jews from German society, including mass murder once World War II started. But how could this have happened? If the Jews were aware of the prophecies and the seeds of propaganda being planted in the minds of the Germans, why didn't they just flee Germany and escape to safer countries? Well, we're going to answer these questions in our next episode of Lest We Forget, the atrocities of the Holocaust. And as you will see, what unfolded during World War II turned out to be a perfect storm of circumstances.
And now we're going to hear from our third host, Betsy Wurzel, who is going to tell you about growing up Jewish in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you, Lillian. Actually, it's 60s and 70s.
Okay,
that's okay. That's okay. Yes, I grew up in a town, Carteret, New Jersey, and I grew up with anti-Semitism. I'll give you some background. My mom grew up in the Bronx in New York. She did not face any anti-Semitism when she was growing up. She did not face it until she moved to New Jersey after she married my father. My father grew up in Newark Hillside area of New Jersey, and he did face anti-Semitism. He told me one time he was tied to a tree. And his grandfather, who had a beard, was religious, was hit with a snowball that had a rock in it. My mother was shocked when a neighbor came over to her and said, "Harriet, Tommy may come over and stare at you. because he was told Jews have horns coming out of their head. Now, folks, this was in the 60s. This is like almost unreal to imagine. I faced anti-Semitism. My neighbors were, their ethnic background was Polish, and they called us all kinds of names. I was called names by other people from other ethnic backgrounds. And it is a small world because my cousin married someone who was a relative of one of these boys. And when I told my cousin-in-law, oh, yes, I know who your cousin is, he used to call me names. And he told his cousin, don't ever say that to me again. So be careful what you say to people because you don't know who knows who, right? My family we had a big backyard. All the kids in the neighborhood played in our backyard. One day, I don't remember what year, it was in the 70s, we came home from going somewhere, and my parents' house was graffitied with shaving cream, thankfully, which was easy to clean off, with nasty things on there about being Jewish. And, folks, I could tell you, it shook me to my core. I was a teenager. These are people that were considered friends, that played in our backyard, that we played with. And to see the hatred, I felt violated. I felt scared. It's frightening. And I want to tell you about this family that I knew in Carteret. I won't say their last name. They were the parents. They looked very old, even though they weren't, but they were survivors of the Holocaust. They were German Jews. They had a daughter. And can you imagine, think about this, not having one single relative, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no grandparents, because they were slaughtered. And they were slaughtered because they were Jewish. I felt so sorry for this young girl, even at a young age. And I saw the numbers on her parents. They kind of kept to themselves. They were very quiet. They died young, and so did their daughter. Sonia died in her 40s. Why did she die young? I don't know. Maybe it was a result of what her parents went through in the concentration camps. Who knows? And I will give a more background. My mother's parents, this is before World War I, were kicked off their land for being Jewish. That was Russia at the time. Now it's considered the Ukraine. They came from around Kiev. So then they came in illegally through Canada. My grandfather became a citizen. My grandmother couldn't because she was busy taking care of her mom. So I say I'm a byproduct of illegals. But the anti-Semitism is still around. I have seen people change their attitude towards me once they know that I am Jewish. My sister one time got into a fight with a friend she grew up with. This girl called my sister Dirty Jew. They met in the park close to the grammar school, and they had a fight. And then they had to stay at the school. My mother was horrified and said, oh, Lori, you should not, fight. And my dad was like, Harriet, Lori did the right thing. That's what you do. You fight back. He said, and that was the problem. Most of the Jews, they didn't fight back, and they couldn't fight back in World War II. But I was taught, you fight. My father told me, you stand your ground and you fight. Someone says something to you about you being Jewish, you say something back. Back then, of course, we fought with our hands, and, we didn't have the weapons that they do today. But when you grow up with it, it's so shocking to me that people could be so hateful, and you could see them do a 180 or a 360 degree when they know that you're Jewish. My maiden name is Wurzel, which is German. My father's grandparents came from Austria-Hungary and Poland, and they were potato farmers. And my father said that his great-grandfather gave the potatoes to Kaiser's army. Love learning genealogy. And that's what I have to say, folks. I want you to be aware of this book. I interviewed back in, I think, October, November of 2021, Dr. Mark J. Strauss. He wrote a book, One-Legged Mongoose, Secrets, Legacies, and Coming of Age in 1950s in New York. He wrote a book about 2 years in his life, I think from the ages of 10 to 12, of the anti-Semitism that he faced growing up in the 50s. This book is available on Amazon.com, and you could probably look up the interview that I did with Dr. Mark J. Strauss. Phenomenal story, very powerful. And I also don't understand, and people might get offended when I say this, but I don't care. I don't know how anyone can call themselves a Christian and say they hate Jews. Isn't that kind of strange, since Jesus was Jewish and came from Jewish lineage? You cannot say you hate Jews and be a Christian. That's my opinion. There's just isn't any way that could be possible. And I really don't understand the hatred. Just the other day, there was someone threw a firebomb at a synagogue in New Jersey. We need to stop the hate. If you cut us all open, we all bleed red blood. We're all alike in many ways, more than we are different. Let's stop the hate, and let's shine our light and be kind to each other, regardless of what our skin color is, religion, ethnic background. And thank you for listening.
We are asking the audience, Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and I, Lillian Cauldwell, all Jewish ladies, we are giving a call to action. We are asking from our audience, what is your take on this series we're doing about the Jewish community in the United States? What would you suggest our take on this material? Would you like to have the transcripts? Would you subscribe to receive the transcripts? Please send in your comments. We don't want you to be shy. Send it to the primary email address at the station, pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Let us know how involved you are with what's going on around you and how it relates to Lest We Forget. We know you're out there. It doesn't matter what your race, religion is. We are all in it together. But the most important thing is we do not want history to repeat itself. So what are some of the solutions you see that we could try down the road? Let's try and rectify this situation once and for all so that we can start addressing the other ills of the world. You can text us at 484-364-1032. Remember, you're part of the solution. Now, the sources used for the timeline was from myjewishlearning.com, history.com. Just put in the Holocaust. You'll get a lot of information. And theatlantic.com, which is a magazine. And again, just put in the key word or phrase, Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and you will get to the articles. Lisa, do you have any resources you want to share with the audience?
Yes. My information came from the book authored by Daniel Green and Edward Phillips called Americans and the Holocaust. The new Ken Burns documentary called the U.S. and the Holocaust, and a book called The Jews Should Keep Quiet by Raphael Medoff. It's about Franklin D. Roosevelt, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, and the Holocaust, and a variety of articles that I found on the Internet. So, and the thing that's really interesting in my research is all of the information that I obtained through these resources were very consistent with each other.
Yes, yes. The old rule we learned in school, if you find it in 3 or more resources, they are considered common knowledge. And folks, if you just put in the Holocaust or Hitler or anti-Semitism or any of those key words or phrases, you will receive a plethora of information to confirm and agree with what you've heard today from Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and I, Lillian Cauldwell. We want to thank you very much for coming and listening to our first episode, Lest We Forget, the U.S. Jews and the Holocaust. And we want also to hear back from you. Our next episode will appear next week, and we will be doing it by video. So please to be sure to join us. We will release the date and time so you can. You can hear this program all over again on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, on our website, https://passionateworldtalkradio.com, and all of social media. Thank you very much for listening, and remember, please keep listening. Thank you.